Oh, let me go ahead and say got it. All right.
Welcome, everybody, to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. I'm joined on this episode by comics creator, author, artist Ben Towle. Ben, welcome to Words, Images, and Worlds.
Oh, thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you. Glad that you said yes. And as I was saying before the show, I continue to connect with comics and graphic novels. I'm a wide reader. I try to read very widely, and you and I have the common friend in Craig Fisher,
Yep.
and that I think he was the first person that said, "Check this guy out." So Oyster War was actually the first book that I checked out and really enjoyed, and got the print edition of Oyster War,
Oh,
which is
nice,
just
nice.
like huge. It's a huge book.
Yeah, it's very deliberately done, sort of the size of a European album, so
Mm.
it's and it's kind of born of my love of a lot of European comics, Tintin and stuff like that. And it's set up, with that physically bigger size is a whole different sort of storytelling mechanics. Not most obviously because you wind up with your sort of base grid that you use is a four-tiered grid.
Mm.
Uh, that's sort of the more European standard versus the sort of three-tiered grid that you get with most American books that are sort of 6 by 10-ish.
Nice, nice, yeah. So was it European comics that sort of got you into the medium, or was it something else that kind of broke you into comics as a reader?
Oh no, no, you'd have to go way back. The my interest in sort of European cartooning is a lot more recent. How did I get into comics? Kind of as a reader, I guess this will date me, but I am old enough that when I was a kid, there were comics in the spinner rack things. Um,
Same, same,
yeah,
yeah.
at every drugstore and convenience store and stuff. And so I think, I had some exposure to comics early on. I had a woman that would look after me when I was a little kid, and she had a bunch of like comic strip collections kind of floating around. She
Hmm.
had a Betty Boop collection that I remember pretty well, and like I think a Little Orphan Annie collection maybe that I remember reading a lot, sort of over and over again. I definitely remember, getting the Marvel Star Wars adaptation when that came
Oh
out.
yeah, oh yeah.
It came out actually before the movie. Um, not necessarily because I was a big comics person, but because I was just like a little science fiction nerd, and like there's all the Star Wars hype. So you got any kind of like if someone gave you like Star Wars Kleenex, you'd be like, I gotta have it.
Right,
Um,
right. The bubble
but I
bath,
think
all the things.
yeah, yeah, and I think that but I think the first, like, the my real intro to comics is something that I was sort of passionate about and sort of made me sort of a convert rather than just sort of having it be this stuff that's sort of part of the part of your sort of normal surroundings. Was starting to go to the neighborhood 7-Eleven and going through that spinner rack. And I remember very specifically picking up a Simonson Thor issue. It wasn't
Yeah.
the very first one. It wasn't 337, but it was probably like 339 maybe. I think it's the one with the pink cover. Um, if I had my comics out, I could tell you which one because it's the one that's all beat up. Um, now, yeah, I remember getting that one and really being kind of blown away by it. And also kind of that being, I think, where I sort of put together that like comics were a thing that they were drawn by a person, and like that was their
Mm.
job was to draw these stories. Um, and at that point, that's what kind of really set me on the path. And at that point, I was sort of kind of going around town on my bike, hitting the various 7-Elevens and Roses and places like that to pick up stuff that looked interesting. And then at some point, I graduated into conning my mom into driving me to a comic shop in Virginia Beach. I was living in Norfolk at the time, so then I started buying stuff, and that was a whole other kind of revelatory experience because this would have been mid 1980s, maybe mid to early 80s.
Mm.
So like I'd been reading the Thor and the Alan Moore Swamp Thing and that kind of stuff, and then some more mundane stuff like I don't know who was drawing Iron Man at the time, but I was really into Iron Man. But then you wind up and that's the kind of stuff that was on the spinner racks at like 7-Elevens and stuff. But then if you went to local comic shop, there was this whole other world of stuff out there that you just didn't really necessarily see. So that's when I started reading, like the Flaming Carrot and Neil the Horse and Alien Legion and all that kind of stuff. So
Mhm.
that's kind of a very long answer for a very simple question, but yeah, that was sort of my intro.
No, no, that's a great answer. And I think there should be a podcast somewhere called like Spinner Rack Kids, because I was the same way. I went out and would just kind of find them wherever. It was almost like a Mad Max movie for comics. It was like you just found them wherever you could. We would have like a comic shop that would come into town and go out of town
Mm.
mysteriously. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and it made it, you really did have to kind of, because there was just no telling what was going to show up on those things. So, if you got, some issue or something, you're like, oh my God, like this alien's turned into Thor. I wonder what's going to happen next. Well, you might be out of luck if they just didn't, next, a month later, you roll into that shop or roll into that 7-Eleven or whatever, and they just have whoever stocks those things didn't stick the next issue in there. So you did kind of
Mhm.
have to like you say, sort of Mad Max-esque. You had to kind of kind of roam around and try to find this stuff. In my case, at least until I discovered like comic shops.
Absolutely. And I can tell from your answer talking about the grid, you also do like you do the instructional side of comics. You have that part of your work as well. So
Hmm.
that kind of flows into the next question as well, like a fandom, but also some of the technical aspects of what do they allow you to do in the stories that you want to tell.
Oh, like comics in particular. I mean, I guess it's a weird question to kind of get into, just because like I don't know that's like, what does comics allow you to do as opposed to some other thing.
Right,
And it's
right.
like I don't know how to do any other things.
This
So
is
it's
the
like,
thing.
yeah, this is the thing. So it's kind of like, hey, Jimi Hendrix, why did you write Purple Haze on a guitar and not a harpsichord? It's like, well, because he's a guitarist.
Right, right.
So it's like, I guess rather than it being the case that like people have narrative ideas and then they choose like, okay, this one's going to be good for a movie and I'll do this one as an opera and then like I'll do this one as a comic. I guess sort of, at least in my case, I'm just sort of I'm a cartoonist, so the ideas that get traction with me are things that I think are going to work well as comics. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah, that
um,
makes sense.
but I mean, I do love I think that I'm not a big fan of this sort of comics versus other media as some kind of like a ranked contest, but it does have certain things that are unique to it that I like. I mean, obviously, I enjoy drawing, so I would be out of luck if I was trying to make a movie out of stuff. I like drawing things, and then I like the sort of diagrammatic nature of comics. That like I think comics is far too often, particularly in the modern era, sort of discussed and thought of as if it was almost the same thing as films. With people talk about shots and all this kind of stuff, but like the most interesting comics to me are not comics that are made up of like shots. They're comics of people like Chris Ware, for example, who are thinking of the medium and what it can do. They're comfortable with it, with comics as being a group of drawings, and then they understand that like drawings can do things besides just describing a literal thing that you might see mimetically.
Right,
um
right.
so some of that stuff, it's funny, I talk a lot about that, but I so rarely actually do any of that stuff. I wish that I did that more often. But I do enjoy that kind of stuff, and you also see it a lot in that kind of thinking process in a lot of like shoujo manga, like the girls manga, where
Mhm.
you'll have, I don't know what's a good example. Like, I don't know, like the main character will be worried about, school and her boyfriend and all this kind of stuff. And rather than seeing them like a picture of them sitting there thinking about, gosh, I'm so worried about my school and my boyfriend, like you'll get a big like full page or a huge splash panel of them with all of the sort of things that they're thinking about and worried about sort of arranged around them in a way. And I love that kind of stuff. And that is the kind of stuff that comics is really good at. And again, it's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
contest. I'm sure you can do that, and there's probably a way to figure out how to do that, in film or whatever. But like that's because comics is made of drawings. I love the fact that like you can, there's things that you can do with drawings that are not just describing like a literal scene.
Yeah, yeah. There's this page in Dave Baker's Forest Hills Bootleg Society that he did with Nicole Gu, where
Hmm.
like they're breaking down characters and they're almost like these labeled like pieces and parts. It's almost like it's not a character web, but there's a
Hmm.
person at the center, and that's
Oh, that
just one
sounds
of
very
those.
cool.
Yeah, yeah, it's a definitely a medium that you can do some really, really interesting and cool things with. Um,
Yeah, I wish we saw more of that, or like maps or something that I think, really lend themselves well to comics because maps are drawings, and
mhm,
comics that
mhm.
incorporate maps, even as corny as it sounds, but like that, the family circus thing where you see little Billy or whatever his name is running around. I think that stuff is neat. I mean, because it's very comic-y. It's comics that's comfortable with being drawings and really sort of embracing what you can do with drawings.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mentioned two-fisted tails kind of at the center of
Ah,
the next
four-fisted. It's
question.
animals.
Or I'm sorry, four-fisted. Sorry, sorry. Four-fisted tails. Sorry about that. As kind of the center of the next question. But I just did that because that's the most recent.
Mhm.
But if there's another book that you want to like kind of plug in there to talk about the process of creating, that's totally fine. But just curious about, since that is one of the more recent ones to hit the
Mhm.
market, if you wanted to talk about the inspiration behind that a little bit.
Like the inspiration or the actual like sort of process.
I'm actually interested in both. Um,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll hit one at a time. So inspiration wise, I think like a lot of people, I keep a basically an idea file. It's not, like in the olden days, you'd have a physical file. In my case, I just have a big Word document, and I have a bookmark or a folder of bookmarks or anything, something I stumble on something that's kind of interesting. I'm like, hey, that, I need to remember that. And I think for Four Fisted Tales, which I mean, whether your listeners know, is a book I did recently that's all true stories of animals in combat situations. So like carrier pigeons and messenger dogs and war elephants and things like that. Um, but it started, I think, because I was looking for something, completely unrelated online, and as often, happens, I stumbled on something that wasn't really what I was looking for, but it was a list in Wikipedia of just a list of like notable animals from armed conflicts, and I was like, well, that's kind of interesting. I started reading
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
and I was like, well, I'm going to save this, and I did. I think I mentioned it on Twitter, and people were like, "Oh, that would be very cool anthology." I was like, "Yeah, that would be a very cool anthology." And so I kind of had imagined it for a long time as being, uh, like an anthology where different cartoonists or different teams of people would each tell the story of one of these animals. And if I'm remembering correctly, I was in talks with at least one publisher about doing it that way, but I just could not get enough of a advance out of them to pay a decent page rate, and it's like
Mhm.
I'm more than willing to take a take a crummy advance for my own work, but it's like if I'm the editor and I'm going to be like hiring people to do stuff, I want to be able to pay them well. So I was just like, well, this
Right.
isn't going to
Right.
work. And so I kind of shelved it and actually started working on something else for a while. And then, a couple of years later, I saw some article maybe on the Beat about a new um, graphic novel imprint from a prose publisher that specialized in like military history and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, hey, I got an idea for that.
Mhm.
And so that's why you keep your idea file. I kind of dug back into my idea file and put together a pitch, did I can't remember, like a 4 or 5 page sample of it and set it off, and that's where that kind of came from. What's the other part of this? Oh,
This
process.
process.
Process wise, yeah, honestly, like every book I do so far anyway has had kind of a different process to it. Um, Four Fisted Tales is the only book I've ever done that's entirely digital, so it was all completely done in Clip Studio. I didn't. One thing that I find with digital that's kind of a it's a con. It's very difficult. It's very easy where your thumbnails to turn into sort of more than thumbnails because when you're working physically, what prevents your thumbnails from getting overly detailed or consuming too much time is that they're physically small, right? But if you're on a screen, you can always just zoom in. So with Four Fisted Tales, I kind of like I sort of my thumbnailing, my penciling were sort of the same thing in a way, which I have some pros and cons. But it was purely digital. For other books, though, I've done different stuff. But previously to that, I've all done ink, nibs and old school watercolor brushes on sheets of Bristol board.
Mhm.
I guess the only thing that I would say is a constant with my process of putting together a book is that I try to never really like separate the words in the pictures, and I think that like in some comics you have to do that. Like if you're working on Amazing Spider-Man or whatever, there's a bunch of people involved, and there's one person who writes it, and there's another person who pencils it, and there's another person who inks it or whatever. So you have to kind of have a situation where you have a script, right, which is like the words without any pictures. Even though the writer in their brain is probably thinking about pictures, they're writing the words down. Then they get handed
Mhm.
off to the penciler. The penciler looks at the words and puts now comes up with pictures. And to my mind, if you're not in that situation, it's just you. There's no reason to ever separate those things. So I guess that's the one common thing for me is that I don't see much value really if you're just an individual cartoonist in doing a script where you've stripped
Mhm.
out the visual element, gone with just words, and then go back again and try to put those visual things back in. So all of my preliminary process involves, even if it's just like stick figures and stuff, involves, I start working on the visual element at the same time I'm working on the plot and that kind of stuff.
I love how the image is the center of what you do and what you think about the medium and also your process. It's really cool to center it in that way.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously people have different methods, but to me it just seems so obvious. It's a medium that's made up of little drawings. So like the sooner and the sooner you do it in time and the more emphasis you're giving to those drawings, I think the better your work is going to be.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Um, so what is it that you hope readers take away? Well, and also before we get to that, maybe I'm just curious about you have this idea file. Um,
Mm.
do you kind of follow the path of inspiration as far as deciding what's next and kind of going through those parts of the process and just kind of what you're curious about at the moment? It kind of sounds that way.
Yeah, there is. I mean, every once in a while, there's something like with Four-Fisted Tales, like you see, there's an opportunity, and you're like, oh, this is a great match with this. Like, here's the thing I've
Hmm.
been thinking about for a while, but never really moved on it. Well, here's a publisher that this is exactly what they do. Maybe I move this thing to the top of the heap. But yeah, for me, there's a lot of like, I mean, I've always had kind of a day job. So there's pros and cons to that. Obviously the con is that you wind up working a lot more slowly at your comics because you're doing something else for 40-ish hours a week. But the pro of that is that you basically get to choose what you're going to do. Like you're never doing comics because, the mortgages do. You're doing comics. So I really enjoy having the agency just to pick something that I'm creatively interested in and executing it, and then knock on wood, getting a publisher interested in it later. So yeah, I definitely pick things kind of based on sort of what usually kind of what's moving me. So like for example, Oyster War, you mentioned that. That was a book that I did, and that's got, ghost pirates and sea monsters and all kinds of crazy stuff in it. And I did that after doing two fairly straight historical fiction novels and, or graphic novels. And so I did one about an airship disaster at the North Pole in the 1920s that was called Midnight Sun, which has long since been out of print. And then I did another one for Disney Hyperion about Amelia Earhart. And I enjoyed those books, but like after having done two of those, I really kind of was like, I want to do something that's out of that mode. I want to do something that has fantastic elements in it. And then, as you notice, for the book itself, it's color, which I hadn't done before, and it's kind of a different format stuff. So yeah, I deliberately do pick stuff that I kind of yeah that sort of appeal to me, that I find interesting, and a lot of times that will be based on sort of a reaction to what I've done before, or just a
Hmm.
desire to move on to something different and more and challenging in a different way, just so I don't get sort of stuck in a rut.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and consistently across the board, I appreciate the attention you give to the picture, to the narrative, and there are just so many details in what you do. I remember the first time I picked up Oyster War, and I was, oh my gosh! I mean, it's not only that big volume, but those pages
Mm.
are really packed. I mean, you can tell it's a labor of love.
Yeah. I mean, I love the drawing aspect of it, and it's, I mean, as a cartoonist that like you're putting a panel down and people are kind of glancing at it and then moving on, in a couple of seconds, but you still, that's your work out there, and you want to create a convincing. I think I've heard someone describe the comics as sort of like a clockwork universe. It's like you want your clockwork universe to be convincing, and I think like, one of the things like an oysterware, for example, I love designing environments and stuff like that. So in oysterware, there's a lot of like, if you look at some of the details and the wooden ships and stuff, there's a lot of like nautical, like fish motifs and like lots of
Yeah.
stuff like that. And I love throwing that stuff in because I know that nobody maybe consciously notices it, but it does. At least I believe it does kind of help that sort of clockwork universe be believable and be unique. Um, and that's one thing that I really liked. And maybe that's sort of a common element carrying over from my previous sort of historical fiction stuff. Is you do have
Mhm.
to pay attention to, you can't have people in your Amelia Earhart story, with iPhones and stuff. You have to like, you have to pay some attention to how you like architecture and design stuff. And even when you move into sort of a fantasy element, I guess I kind of still retain that idea that you want it to be a cohesive, convincing environment, even if it's a fictional one.
That makes total sense, and I can totally see that in the joy of the work and the joy of reading the
Mhm.
work. So the original question before I took a side note was, what do you hope readers take away with them? And then I always also like to save the last part of the recordings for anything that you want to share about that's in development or upcoming events. I know we're in like comics convention season, so also a space to talk about some of those things as well.
Oh, okay. So let's back up to the first one. So what do I want people to take away? That's kind of it's hard to say. I mean, honestly, like mostly when I don't set out to I don't have sort of a thesis, like I'm not
Mm-hmm.
trying to sort of prove anything. And I feel like sometimes you read comics or you see other media where people are really kind of beating you over the head with like some sort of point they're trying to make. And I consciously have themes in my book, but I try to, I guess my main mission is always to make a story that's enjoyable. I tend to, it's funny. I've been like, I occasionally been nominated for awards and stuff like that. And my previous books have been, a lot of them been nominated as like best book for kids. And it's like, oh, they think it's a kid's book, like I just kind of make books that I would want to read. Like I
Hmm.
don't really think, I mean, again, this is maybe a little bit of a luxury of having a sort of a day job where you don't have to worry about target audience and sales and stuff as to a huge extent. I just basically make a comic. When I sit down and make a comic, I just make a comic that's as good as I can make it and make it be the kind of thing that I would want to read. Um, so I guess I don't really have sort of an overt point, but I mean, I guess I want people to come away from my work like having enjoyed a good story, or like in the case of my Four-Fisted Tales, like there's stories in there with a beginning, a middle, and an end, but I also want them to have like learned about something in that case that they maybe didn't know about, and in the case of that's probably my most sort of overt book with the most overt sort of point to it. I just want people to come away from there thinking about this stuff that's maybe just sort of on the periphery of history, and that to think a little bit about the moral ramifications of of using, and it is using animals to do stuff like on a battlefield, and I
Yeah.
I hope that like the book does not beat anyone over the head with what my thoughts are, and I mainly just want people to think. I don't necessarily want them to reach some specific conclusion.
Yeah. And then you mentioned there's a heap, and things sometimes get to the top of the heap in your work. So I would love to
Yes.
have a peek at your Word document, but won't ask for that.
Oh yeah, so you asked about other stuff, like other projects. Yeah, so right now, this I had actually I mentioned at one point that I had sort of like filed away this Four-Fisted Tail stuff and started working on something else. And what I had started working on is something I've now come back to, which is I'm doing this is sort of a reaction, like I've never done anything that was sort of set in a relatively recent time period. And
Hmm.
I've never done anything that's really kind of a slice of life thing. I've done most of my stuff has been historical fiction or, sort of fantasy adventure kind of stuff. So I'm currently doing a book that takes place in the 1990s that's about a guy who plays in a band and who works in a restaurant as his day job and winds up getting in a cooking contest with a rival of his at the restaurant. And to further complicate matters, I've done it all as a funny animal comic. So
Oh,
they're all
nice, nice.
so they're all animal characters. Because at some point, it sort of during my during when I was putting together Four Fisted Tales, I got kind of interested in the kind of history of animal characters and animal cartooning.
Yeah.
Part of that was just me, and part of that is from some of my teaching. I teach a character and environment design class at the art and design school where I teach. And so I just decided I would sort of try my hand at it. So that's sort of what I'm working on
Nice.
right now, and it's been interesting. It's going to be about 130 pages, and I've penciled about 120 at this point. So I'm closing in on the end, and I think I'm going to start once I've got it all penciled and I start inking. I think I start serializing it as a web comic. Probably I've set
Oh,
it up
nice.
so that all the pages divide along the center, so I could cut each of them in half and run them so they'll look nice um, on a computer screen. So
Oh,
I think
very
that's
cool.
probably my plan for that. But yeah, my idea file has all kinds of stuff I'd love to do on it. I don't have any ideas for this, but I think my next big bucket list item I would love to do is something science fiction.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned that's a full circle thing because you mentioned at the beginning that Star Wars and science fiction were part of your jam early on. So that would be
Hmm.
amazing to see.
Yeah, I mean, I read a lot of science fiction, both prose and comics, and I just have never really done or had the opportunity to do any kind of science fiction of my own. So that's probably something. And I've got a few things kind of in the idea file, nothing that's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. But whenever I wrap this thing up, this cooking thing, I'll probably go back and see if I can start to work any of those into something that's workable. And I do actually have a middle grade kind of post-apocalyptic science fiction thing that I've pretty much got written out structurally, and I've done some panels and stuff for. Whether I pick that back up, I don't know. I mean, every once in a while you start something and
Uh,
it just winds up on the heap. But it's completely written, so I feel kind of like I'd be silly to abandon it. But I'll look at that once this cooking thing is wrapped up.
Very cool. Very cool. I love how you continue to explore different works, and that's part of what excites me about picking up your books is I know that there's going to be something unique there, and
Oh, thank you.
yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like you continue to drive forward in that way and
Hmm.
pick interesting projects. So wonderful things. I hope that listeners will check out your work. Four fisted tails, not two fisted
Yes,
tails, as I've said.
absolutely.
There are two more fists with that. Um, and I will also make sure to link your website so that folks can check it out as I
Yeah,
post
that'd
it.
be great. Yeah, all of
Oh,
my social media and junk is all off that main website. So
fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ben Toll, for taking some time and talking with me about your process and your work.
great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.